Can I just check? Everyone okay if I just use gender neutral pronouns?
Yeah.
I use gender pronouns in writing too. Right. Welcome to round 2 of the ABP ABP terrible name 2015. My name is Alfred. I'm the chair of this round. Handling with me are Akshat and Lisa, and with Sarah as a trainee. Without further ado, I'll call the House to order. Invite the Prime Minister to take the stand and begin the speech.
She'll probably move the chairs if you want to like read on the screen.
It's quite true. Do you want me to? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, regardless of whether it was a racial dispute, a dispute of territory, or just in general, any dispute due to civil violence that exists within your nation, considering the fact that we've reached a point where this is a post-conflict society, we don't think that it is fair for us to expect that the moment we allow discussions, that they would allow for a stable form of diplomacy and peace to exist within these post-conflict societies. Considering the fact that these individuals also live their everyday lives with the fresh wounds of this conflicts, we think that we should allow for situations to die down and for individuals to take a step back, calm down before we can actually expect fruitful conversations to happen on the ground. 2 questions in my speech. Number 1, why we think this would provide, why allowing these conversations to exist within a post-conflict society would result in an unfruitful conversation. Secondly, how exactly do we create a much more sustainable and diplomatic government? Before that, a clarification on what exactly are we okay with, right? So number 1, what are we going to do? We're more than willing to disallow any forms of discussion online, be it through narratives of books or outright discussions that exist within the public about what has recently happened with regards to that particular conflict, because the moment that there is discourse in the public, that's where we take a step in and say, no, we disallow it. However, what are the things that we actually allow? We allow for discussions and investigations for like international organizations if they want to find out the truth in order to be able to, like, say, for example, convict someone and bring them to trial if they feel that there is an alleged person that might be guilty in this circumstance. We just think that when it comes to directly dealing with the people on the ground who were direct victims of the situation, we think that we're more than okay with disallowing that sort of conversations from happening. No. First question, why we think these conversations are unfruitful? Given the fact that this time that we are talking about is a post-conflict society in a world where literally they have just come to an agreement as to what would allow for them to stop acting in a violent manner, means that the situation is still within a very much distrustful environment. No, individuals are too highly attached to what has happened. These are individuals who probably understand that, my mother and my father have died and been sacrificed through the past conflicts that has happened. You, as a member of the community, are very likely to have visceral reactions towards any forms of discussion that individuals may talk about, regardless of whether it's a truth or whether it's some form of fabrication of an ideology that other individuals have, because you are more likely to be very defensive because you feel that you are a victim in that particular matter and what you think is the most right because of that visceral reaction, right? Parents at this point in time disallow their children from mingling with the other group despite that agreement existing. At least that's what the situation is like in the majority. And you don't want to associate yourself with that other group of individuals. Even if you do, the societal expectation from the people coming from your community is that you cannot trust them despite having individuals in positions of power already agreeing to certain diplomatic agreements. So what is likely, given that context, the discussion that would happen on the ground? The discussion that would happen on the ground is going to be everything that comes from a perspective of having fresh wounds. You're quick to blame. You're quick to be defensive. You have a lot of victims narrative coming from all parties involved. You feel the need to avenge, even if not through violence, because laws disallow it, at least through the accumulation of allowing supporters to realize that your cause is greater than the other communities of which you are interacting with. No. When you talk about it, and given the context that you are in, it means that you are very likely to constantly remind yourself of the bad. Because let's not just talk about post-conflict societies in and of itself. Human nature dictates that. The more you talk about the problem, and because you are hurting and you are always talking about the hurt that you feel over and over again, you are reminding and instilling that belief continuously in your mind and the community around you. Discussion in and of itself is not a good. We have to look in the value of that discussion, and we think the one that exists within this discussion is one that is invaluable to create that peace. Opening.
So in post-apartheid South Africa, how would you have addressed the structural poverty of the Black South Africans, if not with an acknowledgement of the harms of apartheid?
Look, it can be through direct dealings. Okay, I'll deal this with my second extension, where I'll be talking about how we actually allow for individuals to make changes purely based on the merits and what individuals need, rather than being swayed by the rhetorics of victims that try to tell out their stories through a very visceral manner. Because the second question to that is, how do we change that? How do we create a more sustainable government? Firstly, is by allowing individuals to have some form of healing time. We understand. Obviously, you feel the need to talk about it, but take a step back. Think about what has happened in a sense where you are able to divorce yourself, at least by the littlest of kind, so that you are not too attached, so that you are not quick to blame and be defensive. This means that when you are more able to calm down and talk about it in future, that's when you allow a more valuable discussion in future, in comparison to allowing them to talk now until that point in time, because that means all you're doing is prolonging the discussion that comes from a visceral perspective, and that's not something that we want in order to finally achieve a much more rational conversation at a much shorter time. But secondly, we now at least disallow for people in positions of power and politicians to exploit on these sentiments, right? Many people who try to forward their agendas and position harp on this victim narrative and the sort of sentiments that individuals feel on the ground, right? Despite us having an agreement, we're considering the fact that you are allowed to talk about this, you allow politicians to now also talk about it and tell them, look, we cannot let them win because they're the individuals who have killed your mother, your father, and your friends and your neighbors. You create a literal world where political talks revolve around things that are not purely focused on merits. We, directly dealing with Mifzal's POI, to deal with post-apartheid situation, we are more willing to give politicians the avenue to talk about merit-based things without having to harp on the hurt that individuals have faced. You can just be like, look, we think that you have not gotten enough education, let's give you more education. Rather than saying you have not gotten education because the individuals that you are living with disallowed you, did not believe that you are inherent individuals that have a basic right towards education. They're the individuals who have purely oppressed you. We should never trust them. That's why we deserve education. And sometimes the point at which you hop on this sort of sentiment, what it means is that you are also okay with forwarding the rights of these communities coming at the expense of others. Because that's what happens to politicians when they try to fight for education, but still hopping on the sentiment. They say, because other people have oppressed you, let's fight for our education and let them feel how the way they have made us feel, right? This is something that we want to not allow. But thirdly, is because it makes diplomacy and conflict resolution is very difficult. If they're still allowed to talk from the context that they are in, many would speak to their communities that even if we have an agreement and even if we agreed to this initially, really think about it. Are we okay with this agreement? Think about it. These individuals are the people who killed your families and the people of which you love and value. Are we really okay with the current government that we want? If anything, let's revolt against it. What we want is when you are more rational and you think that the current governance that you have post-conflict is still something that you are not okay with. At least you have that conversation in a much more rational manner and be able to have more diplomatic talks, whether with your neighboring countries or international organizations, rather than continuously talking about the victim card and that being the only narrative. We understand, speaking from the perspective that you come from has a value, but we also need to acknowledge that humans have the possibilities of sometimes getting too emotional and too attached to the current context that they are unable to remove themselves from this conversation to have one that is purely based on merit. Thank you.
The Prime Minister for that speech. I'd like to invite the two opposition to stand, take a case outside the opposition.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, a post-conflict society is a deeply divided society that are marked with people who deeply identify with certain identities and characteristics. There are different communities in a deep-rooted conflict. What that means is that resentment still exists, divide still exists. What you do by silencing them doesn't create a rational society that everyone suddenly feels that not talking about it means that I am suddenly more rational, especially when they especially feel deeply invested in the issues that they want to talk about, issues that they feel they should hold the government accountable for. We don't understand how all of those things will be resolved, because what we fundamentally don't see from side opening government is that how they are able to ever create a peaceful silence in which this conflict exists, because they also were never able to tell us the way in which people feel and how cooling time will suddenly create rationality post-conflict when all of these issues are so much more complicated than that. Firstly, let's deal with their setup and why it's extremely problematic. Because their setup inherently contradicted their case. Their setup was about investigating conflict and prosecuting certain individual, creating the exact active discourse that they wanted to avoid. Because their policy will create all of these defensive parties and still create discussions that they didn't want to have. So they needed to take a stance whether they're okay with investigation and whether or not they're willing to take away all discourse whatsoever, because their benefits of not talking about anything at all only exist in a world where there are no discussions, no prosecutions, and no active talks about everything. In that situation, you cannot investigate anyone. No, thank you. So let's deal with what we are willing to defend on our side. We believe that post-conflict societies are inherently complicated, and depending on different contexts, we're willing to do different things. Like, for example, under certain contexts, we are willing for the state to be a facilitative role and an observatory role in dealing with the conflicts that happen. That means that the state will facilitate things like investigation. The state will facilitate discourse from parties that feel that they want to express how they feel about certain issues. We're okay with things like Truth and Reconciliation Committee, for example, what happened in the Rwandan genocide, to account for individuals that are responsible, to attach blame. We are okay with that. But what we are not okay with is any form of active suppression of things that have happened and issues that still perpetuate until today. All those kind of things we're not happy with. Let's first look at post-conflict societies and how they are, because we think that opening government didn't properly tell us how is it a post-conflict society operated. We already told you that they're very divided. They're also extremely resentful, given that a lot of people have died post-conflict, and they feel that it's much easier to demonize a government that didn't talk about the fact that a lot of people were prosecuted or a lot of people died. This is specifically bad because it feels like they are able to demonize the standing government, the only source of stability in that area. No, thank you. We also think that all of this affects daily interaction that translate into discrimination that you're not dealing with by not talking about it. Their merit-based conversation that they wanted to talk about won't happen if you don't talk about the conflict that already happened and how that conflict affects everyday discrimination and how that conflict affects how your interaction is every day if you are a minority race within that particular conflict. No, thank you. So we don't think their merit-based conversation is in any way useful. I'll talk about a few things. Firstly, how this heighten the post-conflict resentment. Second, how this perpetuate existing imbalances. And thirdly, how this policy can be used to silence a minority group. Firstly, we think this heightened post-conflict resentment because post-conflict, what people want to do is understand why the conflict happened, understanding the underlying causes, and have the government deal with that particular underlying causes. This is because people are tired and angry after a war. What they needed to do and what they need to have is some assurance that the same thing won't happen again, and they won't feel confident in a government that won't deal with the problem that caused the conflict in the first place. Like, for example, what we learned from Hitler's dictatorship was that it wasn't just anti-Semitism that caused his dictatorship to perpetuate, but also the poverty within those areas. Those are problems that are significant for us to deal with as well. We think firstly, this also enables people to gain closure. A lot of people want to talk about the problems that they have, want the public to acknowledge that they went through such prosecution. They want the government to also acknowledge that. We think that allows a lot of people to have closure when either the government admits certain amount of suppression towards the people, either they're able to attach blame to certain malicious group, or acknowledge that there was an oppression of minority. We think this allows a lot of people to gain closure when they realize that their problems are being dealt with. This is a direct comparison we'd like to make. As opposed to people not talking about it, they won't be able to gain closure or won't be able to patch up their wounds, as opposed to having a conversation about it and realizing that the government is actively dealing with it. No, thank you. Secondly, we also say that what their policy does is a policy that makes it very easy for the minority groups as well as oppressed people to demonize the standing government. Because of post-conflict sentiments, we don't think that this will be based on rational calculation, but the moment they feel suppressed, the moment they feel that they're unable to talk about their issues, they will perceive that there will be a lack of justice understanding government. That's particularly harmful because the standing of government needs to be a stable factor that deals with their problem, as opposed to be a factor that they can demonize. Thirdly, we think what will be likely to happen is you continue the conflict that exists. Because what happens is that people won't stay in silence as opposed to what opening government wanted to talk about. What's likely to happen is that people who have very, very strong sentiments about the conflict would still come up and talk about it in a moment. Like, for example, let's say in post-apartheid South Africa, like black South Africans were caught for not being able to talk about what he wants to talk about. We think this creates a visceral impact in the media, in which it will blow up on the internet, seeing a minority not being able to talk about issues that he feels very important. A lot of people will be able to identify with that particular minority, given that a conflict just happens. We also think that what this does is perpetuate existing imbalances. Because realize that post-conflict, there are a lot of imbalances, whether it's financial or political. So conflicts come with both imbalances and cannot be resolved without things like gaining a critical mass, things like discourse and understanding of the matter, and an active acknowledgement of the imbalance that was interrelated to the conflict. So what you do under your side is perpetuate existing imbalances and not deal about it. This also leads back to the conflict. And we also think what they needed to defend under their side was that their policy could have been used to actively suppress a minority, and we feel we're extremely happy to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition for the speech, and now to continue the case of side opening government, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to be.
Taliban era, Pashtuns within Afghanistan were told, do not vote for any Tajik politician, despite the fact that he is a technocrat, he's an economist, he's an engineer and a banker and can improve the situation of your country. But we're told that these were the same people who allowed the Americans to enter our country. Even though they were technocrats and were willing to implement policies that will help the country, do not trust them because they're from the opposing side. These are the sentiments that are fresh and exist within the social sphere when people make political decisions, when people interact with one another. Yet somehow side opposition seems to think that individuals will somehow get over these situations the moment they're given the opportunity to talk, without analyzing what kind of talks there will be, will it even be fruitful or not. Before moving on to my issues, just a few rebuttals. Number one, they said, look, we want this government to be used as the moderator to allow discussion to take place. These are the same individuals who are, number one, mistrustful of the government, number two, mistrustful of anyone you want them to speak with. Yet somehow you tell me that the moment the government says, look, we're going to act as a moderator, they're not going to lash out. They're not going to confirm any biases that they have against the opposition party. Because let me tell you, individuals whose mothers, whose grandfathers have been killed by the opposing race and religion do not want you to tell them that you should interact with the other party, and those are humans as well. They want you to tell them that those are people that you should not vote for and trust. These are the kind of biases that will be confirmed once you allow this discussion to somehow take place. And there's no clarification as to how this government, who has recently been formed, government who needs the trust of its people, to somehow be a moderator, and people are going to trust this moderation even at all. And lastly, they told about closure, right? Victims need closure. How long do you think closure should dictate the way societies behave with each other, when this closure is going to lead to more and more sentiments and never allow individuals to come out of the ruins of war and bloodshed? We think we provide individuals to have long-term closure when they realize that their neighbor who is of an opposing religion was not the same person who killed my grandmother or grandfather. We think that's when long-term closure takes place. First issue, let's talk about racial tensions. And let's talk about racial tensions. Number one, we tell you that the fact that the media continuously talks about it, the fact that intergenerational hate continues when you send your child to school and he reads in the textbooks that the Serbs killed all the Bosnians, killed your grandfather, killed your grandmother, we think this is when it actually impacts the interaction that you have. The fact that, are you willing to give a job to the opposing race and ethnicity? Are you willing to act properly with your neighbor? Are you willing to vote for a politician that has the merit but is from the opposing race and entity? Secondly, the guilt that society puts upon you when you actually interact properly and try to integrate with the opposing race and ethnicity doesn't go away when the surface level discussion is continuously what happened in the war, who were the victors, who were the perpetrators, who killed the most number of people. We think on a surface level, it's very difficult to have proper human interaction when these are the conversations around you, right? We think proper interaction with the opposing race or opposing race or religion is going to take place when in the longer run, these are not the discussions that make you feel guilty every time you interact with them, but in the long run, you realize that these are not the same people that I'm supposed to hate. They had nothing to do with the war. They had nothing to do with the bloodshed. Now I am going to trust them without being reminded every day on the TV, every day in the news that they were the perpetrators of the same war that you remember, that you cry about. That's how you create long-term trust in the long run, something that they did not acknowledge. Sit down. Secondly, let's talk about making proper political decisions. Number one, direct exploitation by a lot of politicians who use this race card, who use this ethnicity card to be able to to tell people to vote for me. That's why it becomes extremely difficult for people to make meritocratic decisions, right? Because your mother is telling you to vote for your religious leader or vote for the same ethnicity politicians. It makes it extremely difficult for these people to make meritocratic decisions when voting for politicians. So who are the kind of people that exploit the situation, right? Military leaders, religious leaders. These are the kind of people who are exploiters to be able to hoard the resources that are so easily available post a conflict, because they know that they can use their people of the same religion or race to gather all the votes and take up all the opportunities that come in a post-conflict society, be it foreign aid, be it contracts, be it all other resources that they have the ability to hoard. We think under our side, the likelihood that individuals will at least be able to take a step back from the race discussion and vote properly means that even in the short run, if you don't, if you don't trust government which is of the opposing race, when they bring you water, when they bring you food, when they promise the infrastructure that you so badly need and the jobs that you need, that's when long-term trust in the government, even though they're from an opposing race and ethnicity, is created. That's when you realize that there is no direct link and I should take objective decision. That's what the cooling time is so important, right? It allows you to build a trust to a government that is from a party that you so previously hated. Before I move on, yes, closing.
Okay, so aside from Afghanistan, which I'm shocked you think is a post-conflict state, do governments really have no other tools to like divide people other than rhetoric if that's really what they want to be doing?
They do, but in a post-conflict society, when you remember the deaths which are so important to you, rhetoric is the most important tool that politicians use to make anyone vote for you or support you, right? So, moving on, right? Diplomacy, and this is which was unengaged with, right? We think when international peace treaties, or we think when international resolutions are created, or especially when a conflict involves parties of different nations or other religions, it's very important for this diplomatic treaty or resolution to be supported by people on the ground. When these methods of media are used to exploit people or tell people not to trust this foreign-aided diplomatic talk or treaty, it becomes very difficult to move on for that or actually implement that diplomacy in the first place, right? For example, what happened in Rwanda, right? The All Rwanda Radio was used to an extensive base to tell people to kill the opposite ethnicity, right? And we think it's extremely important, extremely difficult for us to actually keep up with this diplomatic treaties and peace talks when people on the ground are told, don't trust the foreign aided treaties, the government is not going to protect you in the long run. So what can happen in our side? How do we make amendments? We think amendments can be made because we tell the African American or the Africans within South Africa that you deserve the education, you deserve the infrastructure, without actually telling them their neighbor who is white was the person who deprived them of the education, of the financial aid that they researched, and they told us, look, minorities should be able to lash out against the government. The reason why the majority doesn't trust the minority is because of the fact that they view the minority as individuals or groups who never want peace and stability in the government and are continuously lashing out for no reason whatsoever. We think trusting the government, making changes within the political system which are based on merit only takes place when you allow a cooling time, when you allow individuals to take proper decisions without the surface discussion that makes you feel guilty every time you take an objective decision.
Here, here.
Thank the Prime Minister for that speech. I would like to invite the TV opposition, new case or side.
Here, here.
Ladies and gentlemen, in post-conflict societies, the concept of the state has effectively dissolved. Communities are islands where people are in echo chambers in which they only listen to their village leaders or the people of their own communities. There are deep distrusts of governments. And you want, in that context, ladies and gentlemen, for the forefront of the media to be a report of an individual government officer, a policeman, or riot control enforcement agency, ladies and gentlemen, barging into an individual minority's house, arresting them for saying something that's true to their heart, something that they deserve, something that they believed was entitled to their communities. If that doesn't flare up tensions within post-conflict communities, I don't know what does, ladies and gentlemen. The fact is, in this debate, there are no clear winners in regards to how do we best mediate between people who very much believe in the victimhood of their communities. But what we do need to acknowledge in this debate is that not only do people feel very strongly about the systematic oppression that they went through, but sometimes the discrimination that they face today are deeply intertwined with the discrimination they faced in the past, and the lack of acknowledgement of that discrimination is your inability to engage in that discrimination, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's exceptionally important to deal with in this debate. The first thing I'm going to deal with is I'm going to deconstruct how do people react when it comes to post-conflict societies. I'll deal with politicians as well as individual voters. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about a lot more extensively about how you perpetuate the existing structural imbalances, whether politically or economically, when it comes to post-conflict societies, at the point at which you tell minority groups to shut up and put up. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the rhetoric that people talk about. But before I go any further, yes, ma'am.
Look, correcting
past and current injustices can be done through merit-based policies? Why is it so integral that we talk about visceral things that would only cause about visceral reactions?
I'll get to that. Okay, first, several levels, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, the claim that came from opening government is that people will be irrational when it comes to listening to this particular politician or any sort of rhetoric that comes from the government. The presumption under this side of the house is that apparently people are warmongering, unreasonable individuals that are not lethargic or tired from war. The context is post-conflict societies. That means presumably, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about communities that are tired enough of war to be able to come to some kind of middle ground to now become a post-conflict society and no longer a conflict society, ladies and gentlemen. But under that side of the house, why is it much worse for these individuals? Because you create a contrast in society. Sit down. The contrast that you create is that the same angry individuals that are on your side of the house are under our side able to say that at least I want some progression, but number two, at least I'm now able to see on TV what is it that the Hutus or Tutsis in Rwanda were saying on the other side of the fence. But on the other side, you live in echo chambers within your own communities. You only listen to your village leader. You only listen to the same firebrand politicians that are still going to be in your communities, irrespective of any of your laws under that side of the house. You have no countervailing narrative to be able to tell voters that, hey, maybe some of the things that your firebrand politicians were saying were unreasonable. Maybe they were untrue. Because now I can see it on TV and contrast that to what my community leaders were saying at the end of the day. That means that it's more likely under that side of the house that unreasonable voters have a lack of information, they become angry and are therefore uninteractive, the communities that they are supposed to interact with at the end of the day. That creates a worse off society that's more prone to re-enter conflict at the end of the day. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about firebrands and individuals that might stoke the tinders of war. Under that side of the house, you have a greater likelihood of these community leaders or firebrand politicians telling people to disassociate from the state, ladies and gentlemen. Why is that so? Because now it's very easy for them to say, why are we even subscribing to the central idea of a South African nation state or a Rwandan state, ladies and gentlemen? Why don't we just break off and make our own communities under that side of the house? It's very easy for firebrand politicians to say, look at your central government. They're suppressing your right to speak of your righteous dissatisfaction in that particular regard. People aren't able to contrast what their firebrands say in that particular circumstance because on the other side of the discussion, people are being shut up as well. That means there's no way at all for individuals to be able to contrast the information. They are more likely to disassociate for the law enforcement and the state that you so want people to want to associate with. This is especially important because the exact parents that they're talking about are more likely to stop their children from going to school because they are more likely to say that is a government that's providing schools to us, but when you go to school, that will not represent your identity. You're going to a school where your opinions will be shut up and you only have to conform to what the government tells you as opposed to you having a participative say in what your history constitutes your identity. You are more likely in that scenario to have a government which has no loyalty from individuals and people actively not engaging in the provisions that you provide under that side of the house. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, is very important, is that they never once proved to us under that side of the house that at the point at which you suppress the public discussion of these things, that people in the private confines of their households will stop talking about these things, ladies and gentlemen. That means the anger that's perpetuated and not fleshed out in public, ladies and gentlemen, becomes worse under the side of the house. Because now governments can't cater towards government policy to make sure that you have greater unifying efforts in this particular community. Maybe because ethnic tensions are worse off in this community compared to others, ladies and gentlemen, because you can't have a public discussion about it. Politicians are therefore unable to have a reasonable discussion as to where we should prioritize our unifying forces elsewhere, ladies and gentlemen, because under that side of the house, people are having conversations over the dinner table, telling their children to hate Hutus or Tutsis, ladies and gentlemen, and governments can't penetrate that particular conversation. That's why you lock people into echo chambers of silence under that side of the house. At least on the outside of the house, even if people lash out, even if black South Africans are lashing out and just saying that we want more stuff at the end of the day that is comparatively better in comparison to that side, where all you read on the news reports is black South African robs a store, not black South African robs a particular store because he believes that white South Africans are too privileged in that particular community. That particular discussion at least tempers some of the lashing out that happens under that side of the house, but under that side we have a complete a nonsensical whitewashing of that particular community, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of this particular opening half, if you want long-term closure, if you want affirmative action, you want some sort of restorative justice for a deeply entrenched, impoverished community, you need to address the reasons of why they were impoverished to begin with. Silence is negligence, and that is why you must side of opposition.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for the speech and invite the Member of Government to take a stand and introduce the extension of the closing argument.
So far, the examples in this debate that we had about apartheid South Africa, maybe in Afghanistan, as well as we want to bring in the context of Iraq. In all of these conflicts that we have seen in modern era, recognize one interesting pattern, that there has been a minority group that has been disproportionately in power for ages, suppressing and oppressing the majority. In the cases of Afghanistan, it's a minor Taliban population who suppressed average Afghanis. In Iraq, it had been the Sunnis who have been oppressing, a minority Sunni group oppressing the Shia majority. Similar case in apartheid South Africa, where the black majority, even if they were black majority, it was the white population that dominated throughout a long history of South Africa. What this interesting pattern means in this debate is a very important characterization from the closing government that tells you that in all of these cases, the suppression of narratives or discourse that we are proposing from the side government is not of the oppressed group, ladies and gentlemen, but by default, they are the majority in numbers, and highly likely, ladies and gentlemen, that their ideas and their social network, their political capital is already instilled in post-conflict era. A perfect example is the example of South Africa itself, right? When Nelson Mandela came into power, he already ensured that all those discourses are minimized, ladies and gentlemen. Ensured that the whites are integrated within the system. Yes, that generated animosity, and I'll engage with that point from MIF. But most importantly, what remains to be true is that the suppression of this understanding that whatever discourse that we're trying to suppress is the suppression of the minority point of view is absolutely wrong. It is actually the other way around, right? So what am I going to tell you? I'm going to engage with an important idea that came from opening up, telling us that what eventually it means that justice will not be served. I'll tell you that why it will actually help the justice system and will create a better future and create a better policy making and nation making. And secondly, I'm going to tell you that why there is a limited bandwidth of people to assimilate information and to understand and process and take action on the very first place, right? A few unique rebuttals for MIF's arguments, right? First, he tells us that there will be angry men in the society who cannot vent out, will be talking in echo chambers, and that's why nothing will happen. What he sort of assumes that each and every individual who's suppressed there wants to go out in public and bash politicians. We don't think that is true. If you have dinner table conversation or conversation in your tea rooms or in canteen, as long as it's not public and it's within private chambers, we don't think that opening government says that that cannot happen. So you cannot vent out, and individuals cannot vent out. It's something that is not true. But most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, what happens is that about these firebrand politicians that MIF talks about, Recognize that this firebrand politician exists in both the worlds. Even if state takes legitimate actions that they want, even after that circumstances, those firebrand politicians who have ill motivations will go and banter to their public saying they are not doing enough. So at the end of the day, what happens is, ladies and gentlemen, that harm still exists. But what is more important, and that's where we bring in our idea, is in absence of this sort of rhetoric that happens in public domain, you have more other discourses to look into. Because in a post-conflict scenario, you have multiple other discourses that comes in. It's the discourses about how the economic development will happen, which industry should get the resource priorities. Will it be the oil industry or probably the gas industry? How will we bring about investment in future from foreign direct investments? How will the internal resource be mobilized? All of this discussion starts happening in the media because it was majorly absent because it was an oppressive society, right? So all of a sudden, when there is a plethora of discourse that comes in from the perspective of economics, from the perspectives of nation building, the overarching presence and overwhelming presence of this extremely narrow political narrative, because of this emotive connection to it, takes over all the other narratives that are actually required. Now, our problem with this is, as they argue and we agree to them, that these people cannot actually assess all the information in most of the cases and can take the right decision. So we tell you that under that cool down period, if you have narratives that is coming out in terms of economy, in terms of resource allocation, that's something that you can process better within your given bandwidth, ladies and gentlemen, because otherwise all those political discourses delegitimizes the economic discourses, and that's where the real harm occurs, right? So that's exactly why we think these discourses can be and should be suppressed for a period. Yes, sir.
How do you disempower firebrands that exist on both sides if you don't allow, let's say, moderates like Nelson Mandela to co-opt the rhetoric of the post-conflict society and be able to provide a moderate alternative to those firebrands?
Yes, brilliant. The only way to shut down these firebrand politicians is through economic growth, just exactly how Nelson Mandela did it, right? Understand this, that even if you are suppressed and you feel that you're oppressed for a long time as a black person in South Africa, and now the black government is there. If you take the right policies and you see that you are better off economically, that's exactly when those firebrand politicians is automatically shunned out. That's exactly why, ladies and gentlemen, that discourse of economy is far more important than politics itself, right? But let's look into our idea of why exactly, this criminal justice system will actually be better served in our model, right? So first, the very simplistic idea coming from opening opposition is, since there is no discourse, that's why there will be no justice. And that's why, since there is no justice, that's why the government will fail to serve people. This very idea that since there is no discourse, there will be no justice is absolutely stupid. Because in the first place, in this sort of like huge conflicts that we have seen, there are clear identification of criminals who are the high-ups of the military junta that just resigned, or we exactly know that who should be penalized. So we don't think that there is any problem of lack of discourse in public domain. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, criminal justice system newly installed in that state has a direct incentive to serve justice because they want to make themselves relevant in the new state. They want to make an influence and make sure that as a state mechanism, the justice system is upheld. That's exactly why we think justice will come anyway. The problem with discourse is, since it's very emotive, there might be subjective judgment because of public pressure, because of the discourse that you create, right? What we think is objective criminal justice system cannot happen with discourses with disproportionate response that we see. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, the government will never fail if, ladies and gentlemen, you can deliver economic growth, you can deliver stability. Now, we have proven to you, since the very problem that if you have political discourse in disproportionate amount, that is most likely to happen in this status quo, you will not have economic growth, you will not have economically conscious citizen, and that's when your firebrands are empowered, that's when states fail. We're very proud to propose. Sorry,
the member of government for the speech, and now to introduce the extension of site closing opposition, I'd like to invite the member of
what we get from closing government is absolute lunacy. Ghana, Sierra Leone, Canada, Ecuador, Bolivia, all of these places are post-conflict societies in one way or another, whether there is cultural genocide, violent genocide, or other conflict, that are majorities imposing their will on minorities. This characterization of all of these places being minorities oppressing majorities is certainly not a characterization or a realistic depiction of the world that we live in. We're not sure where Rashad is coming from. Secondly, the bulk of their extension is about economic growth. Two things. Number one, these things often cannot happen without justice that is restorative in the first place. These are the reasons why that we think that places like Iraq and Sudan and South Sudan continue to erupt into conflict, is because they try to prioritize development without a preemptive attempt at restoration between the populations that ultimately have access to these resources. And secondly, none of these things are simultaneously exclusive with processes of restoration or public dialogue over conflict. That's the reason why there were simultaneous conversations in South Africa about what proper affirmative action programs would be, and resource allocation and land redistribution happened at the same time that the most rigorous TRC process in the history of mankind took place, and took many, many years. So we think that on the whole, the extension coming out from side closing government is absolutely ridiculous. Let's deal with some of the other constructive coming out from side government before getting into the constructive on our side of the house, though. Starting with the model. The very best case, no thanks Rashad, coming from opening government is that we have an entirely secret and behind closed doors process that achieves nothing for public discourse. We need to recognize that as a truth under the model, something worth acknowledging from the beginning. When they talk about how dialogue is harmful because it dredges up pain, they give us the example of Afghanistan, which is clearly, number one, not a post-conflict state, but number two, we think that actually the most constructive way to heal relationships between individuals is through processes of truth and reconciliation. I'll deal with that substantively in my material constructive. Secondly, they want to talk about how it hampers the future, mostly because you have politicians who leverage factionalism, and that is the most important tool that they have in their tool case to divide their societies. We give you the example of Indonesia in the 1965 massacre of 500,000 Chinese people, and they suppress all dialogue about that massacre. You don't talk about it in Indonesia. It's not found in curriculums. There is a single narrative that is hushed and passed along households. In that case, based on their analysis, they would presume that the Chinese population is now reintegrated, feels at peace with what has happened, and that the Indonesian population treats them equally. That is not the case. They're still clearly ostracized and exist on the margins of Indonesian society. Not only that, the government have other tools to suppress minorities and to divide them along factionalism. And so we think that actually the best counterbalance to their tool of narrative and firebrand politicians is actually to have processes like TRCs, which bring up the truth and actually empower individuals and communities to tell their stories on their own terms and in their own language. We think that's important. So from opening government, in the best case scenario from their analysis, they get states that are not truly post-conflict and politicians who still rely on rhetoric to divide. But we think that that will be the case anyways, because those governments seem to have incentives to divide people anyways. So things like sending military to like voting stations, or stuffing ballot boxes, or like having people disappear. These are all tools that the state uniquely has access to, that in the absence of rhetoric, they can still use to achieve what OG told us they ultimately would. So we think on those grounds, their analysis clearly falls. No, thank you. Next, they told us, we think that the strongest possible response to the is to distance themselves from the past. We think that even if the narrative is violence and division, it's the only tool that they have to push back, and the social narrative and reconstruction of what the truth in that society is incredibly important. And we'll walk through in our substantive how you reaffirm relationships between individuals, not only structurally, as opening wanted to talk to you about, but that is the essence of reconciliation. That is repairing relationships between individuals. No thanks. We're going to talk about two things in our substantive extension today. Number one, truth. Number two, education. On the actions of truth, we think that affirming painful realities and rebalancing measures of power is a critical thing that TRCs achieve through their processes. It fuels the perception of the new regime as distinctly different from that from the past. That is critically important when assessing the legitimacy of regimes and actually moving it to a system that they have rational legal legitimacy as opposed to traditional or like charismatic legitimacy. That means that that state is most likely to survive and perpetuate ad infinitum in a stable way. That is why we have conflict in places like post-Yugoslavia, more so than we do in places like Bolivia and Ecuador and Colombia increasingly, because they didn't have access to truth and reconciliation. So what are the individual processes that are embodied in TRC councils that actually allow individuals to repair relationships? Number one, we think that it changes the divide between private and social memory. We think that public apologies from politicians are incredibly important in acknowledging wrongdoings from the past. More than that, They use literature, film, theater, the arts, community-based programs like the ones in Rwanda that bring perpetrators and victims together to identify on a very individual basis and have public reenactments of a radical kind that returns dignity to the perpetrators as well as the victims. More than that, we think that TRC narratives, no thank you, are the only ones that can disintegrate the harmful dyadic between victim and perpetrator. We think it's important to recognize that in many times, the people who carried out massacres or genocides or who were the lieutenants also feel a very real sense of deprivation because they were forced to do certain things they know were wrong. TRCs are the only process that have the flexibility to accommodate that kind of narrative and that kind of sharing between perpetrators and victims when they sit side by side from each other. I will take closing.
The narratives that come through in a post-conflict society is always written by the winners of that particular war. And that is not unbiased opinion, something that the TRC cannot function on.
Unfortunately, that's not true. Unfortunately, that is true. In places where we don't have TRC are the places that we see victor's justice taking the strongest hold. We think that TRC structurally are actually mechanisms by which states can actually give ownership of that process towards third parties that actually have the interest of redistributing the truth within that society. What happens in a TRC? People have the chance to unburden their grief publicly, to receive from the new nation a recognition that they've been wronged, to discover the truth, receive closure, and offer opportunities to the perpetrators of harms to express remorse. Forgiveness at the end of this process is often the outcome that is critical in repairing individual relationships between neighbors and communities that ultimately leads to societies not reigniting into conflict. That transitions into priorities in education in terms of teaching students and children in the next generations that these things ought not be repeated because your neighbor is not merely Hutu or Tutsi, a constructed identity, but are human beings and have not lost their dignity and humanity by committing injustices. That can only be achieved through these processes that are a very public reenactment and engagement with what has happened in post-conflict societies. That is only to be the most likely outcome in societies where we allow these things to happen and where we empower them to happen. We think that ultimately on their side of the house, the best case scenario is that you lose the best tool to fight back against the whole range of tools that states have to push back against minorities, as well as the fact that you lose the opportunity to truly and irreversibly repair relationships between individuals that will otherwise flare up in 10, 15, 20 years from now. We are very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I think the member of opposition for the speech should not conclude the arguments of the side opposing government like to provide the government with to take a stand against speech.
Here, here.
From closing government, we recognize there can be different kinds of post-conflict societies, right? But we also recognize that no matter what kind of post-conflict situation you are in, whether or not you're an oppressed majority who now suddenly have come into the power and are now essentially taking corrective measures, or whether or not you're the kind of majority that oppressed certain individuals and then shunned that particular story away and sided with it like the closing opposition is trying to tell you, regardless, we tell you from the closing government that it's extremely important that this particular kind of discourses are still kept quiet and not allowed for certain cooling down periods unless those cooling down periods allow certain individuals who are harmed by those problems to be healed. Why so? We tell you that, understand this, that in the case of the opening opposition, where they tell you that these minority individuals are individuals who are hurt, who require closure, who require to be healed, the problem is that these individuals are not just hurt, they're hurt to great degrees, right? Their family members have been killed and they've suffered through a lot. So essentially, what is it that they require from the systems or from the governments or politicians when they're buying into the rhetorics that these particular politicians, the firebrand politicians, are actually exploiting on. They're requiring disproportionate forms of affirmative actions. They're requiring disproportionate forms of justice. How does that really boil down to sit, Mirza? What really happens is recognize how, in terms of the problems of conflicts of Pakistan and Bangladesh, what really happened was that Pakistan eventually was the losing side, right? So what did the winning Bangladeshi government eventually ended up doing? The Pakistanis who were left within Bangladesh were shunned into little camps, small rooms where their families have been living for 3 generations without any citizenship, without any regard to education, food, or any basic supplies, even though these individuals were not the individuals who participated in war, but generally just Urdu speaking, that kind of ethnicity that remained in this area because they could not really escape. So what happened to these individuals? Because people, the Bengalis who suffered during the war, believed that these are individuals who come from the same ethnic races and whatnot, and believed that these are the individuals who were by default siding by the other side, automatically required the governments to create and to not allow for citizenship. How do these individuals do that? When the discourse becomes a public momentum and gets traction, the voting banks go into these majorities who are oppressed. And because they have these disproportionate demands, the governments have to meet these demands. Essentially, what does that do? It creates problems within the criminal justice system, and which is exactly what happened in Bangladesh. And now 40 years later too, the governments are still banking on the same voter banks and still creating disproportionate forms of criminal, still meting out justice that is not really justice, because they're only punishing oppositions who might have sided, whose generations might have sided with the other side of the oppressed minority, right? At that particular instance. So we tell you, in any post-conflict area, since people are hurt, they demand things in the name of justice from the government, which is not really justice. And as a result, this is something that we cannot allow as a society that needs to be built on peace. But before we move on, Myth.
In Rishad's speech, he agrees that these stories and this rhetoric will still be passed on in hushed whispers in private spaces. How do you get that out of people's minds if there isn't a definitive?
So basically, we really do agree that these kind of discourses, these kind of ideologies remain, these kind of hurt really remains. But what can be fixed is if you take away the discourse and then start meting out justice, like the criminal justice system should. Because guess what? The government is not being pressured by individuals who are hurt and creating the pressure on the justice system or the government to mete out this justice, but simply because this is the process, because the truth TRC, as the closing side is trying to tell you, tries to come in once the conflict is over, is when the government can independently look into these situations where problems were really caused, is when there does not need to be media attention, but the really known, acknowledged troublemakers are already brought under the justice system, tried and given their punishments without having to think about this over media, without having to make people happy, but essentially giving justice in a way how it should be delivered, as a result of which the justice system becomes independent of peer pressure, as a result of which when this justice system is delivered, and like Rishad said, this will be delivered because the criminal justice system has the incentive to become independent of the government and prove that in this newly created state, it is able and independent of delivering such justice. What happens is that these people essentially at the end of the day find closure. As a result of finding this particular closure, due to this criminal justice system, they eventually can relate and heal. And as a result of that, they can trust government. But more importantly, like Rishad told you, I'll take you. But more importantly, as Rishad told you, what also happens is that these particular individuals during that time, it's not a vacuum when these discussions are being stopped. There's discourse about economic progression. There's discourse about where the society should be moving towards, as a result of which, recognize that all individuals have a very limited bandwidth. When you take the emotive big discussion out of this picture, where they're only talking about how they were harmed in the past, what they're actually now talking about is where their future is, where they should be going forward, what they should be voting for in terms of economic decisions, where they should be voting for in terms of labor rights, in terms of their citizenship rights, in terms of their responsibilities in a society that they're now walking into. What really happens is recognize how each individual only can think for certain levels, right? They can only focus on a few things as rational individuals because they do have their own lives to lead. So what they essentially do is they choose politicians on the basis of where the future is. They choose a society towards which they really want to go, which is independent of how they've been harmed in the past, but more into or looking into more into how they'll prosper in the future.
Okay, so in many cases, you cannot get any measure of truth from prosecution. You can only get it through TRCs. What do you do in the case of those instances where you get no information?
See,
without-
if a government is really not really supportive, the way they say that if the government was the one who were majority oppressors, then essentially TRC cannot go in and work anyway. Recognize that TRC can only go in the way the CO tries to tell you and work with a particular government when the government wants you to come in. And when is that best served? We tell you that is best served when there is no discourse happening about it in terms of opinions and speculation in people, when there are rhetorics flying all around the place, but rather when this particular discussion is unbiased and free of popular opinions and more on factual reasons how TRC operates, right? So essentially, what does this debate boil down to? It asks, we want to know what kind of discourse really happens in post-conflict society. From side government, we tell you, no matter what kind of conflict it was, the idea is about disproportionate demands of justice, which creates problems, which creates structural imbalances in terms of policy making because individuals demand so from their governments. And in order to not give that, in order to not create a new cycle of oppression of neo-minorities, in order to not create a cycle where in trying to give away too much for affirmative actions, you take away from the rights from those who did not really participate but were just passive participants of a particular situation. What really should be done is create a vacuum where there is no such discourse so that actual real ideas fly in, actual discussions fly in, and political participation is only about the way forward. People need to heal, and that is the way people can be allowed to heal. We stand for peace. Thank you.
I think I don't move for that speech. And now to conclude the debate as whole and invite the opposition way to take a stand against the speech.
When in Israel and Palestine, you have textbooks that still say that Israelis are the enemy and that Palestinians will probably at some point turn against us. We think this is the perfect reflection of how you portray a particular account of conflict today ultimately determines the kind of fate far beyond the right now. And we think in most instances, this often determines whether or not peace will still even exist to begin with. That is precisely why you need truth commissions right now to be able to check the process by which we are able to arrive at a particular narrative that we can then tell and transmit to generations to come, right? Because ultimately we do want peace in the long term, and that is precisely why the kind of narrative we paint today matters so much. That is what you get from my partner that they on their side completely just disregarded. Three assumptions that I want to address before I move to my two issues for you today. The first assumption that they make on government side is this entire idea that people will at some point just stop talking, right? Like with their policy, people will just somehow stop thinking about it. So now, while opening opposition discusses this entire idea of it's probably a bad idea to silence all these people or minorities, we think what we bring to you in closing opposition is the fact that whatever narrative you forward today will more likely or probably live on intergenerationally, right? The problem with that is then you get the transmission of hostility, which is the link to why conflicts will happen in the future, will probably happen in the future on their side. That is the importance of TRCs or the apparatus of truth commissions that we bring to you in closing opposition. The second assumption that they make on their side is this idea that we can still achieve justice after the cooling time that they would so like to propose, right? Well, opening opposition discuss this entire idea of how, well, we have to address the reasons for conflicts right now. What we do in closing opposition is extend this debate further, right? We have to be able to consider that when it comes to the mechanism of a lot of these truth commissions, it's so crucial that you collect the information you get right now, right? Before cleanup has even happened, before people have been able to cover up exactly what has happened within the conflict to begin with. That is why you need to gather information at that very moment. That is why you need to hear the stories of the people at that very moment before they even have a chance to fix the kinds of narratives that they will tell. The lack of which ultimately compromises the narrative of justice that you will be able to portray, and likewise the kind of closure that we want these people to get in the future. Third assumption, no thank you. this entire idea coming from closing government primarily, that people cannot cope with the information that they get from media, right? That somehow they'll receive this plethora of things that will finally distract them and lead them to actually ask for disproportionate demands from the government. We say more than just access to information, which you get from opening opposition. What you do in closing opposition is the fact that at the end of the day, we want to be able to empower individuals who have just suffered from post-conflict, from these kinds of conflicts, right? That's precisely why in Sierra Leone, for instance, the fact that they're able to properly nation build today is precisely because the very people themselves led the truth commissions that happened within society. No international body stepped in, the people themselves figured it out. We think that is a particular nuance or a particular example today that has happened, and we think that's something that we would want to continue to encourage on our side. But before I move on, yes, opening.
Dining table discussions are exacerbated when the father gets to turn on the TV and show his children a segment of the opposition, accusing them of injustices. You don't create understanding, you create confirmation biases that provides for inaccurate information for TRCs.
All right.
How do you remove?
Okay, what you get on your side instead is then you just have the dining hall conversations, which we think ultimately insulates the very hostilities, which if you think about it, is precisely what leads to extremist groups coming up to begin with, because that's where they start talking about these kinds of things within the particular bubble without actually engaging with the other groups that exist within society. Yeah. Two issues today. Firstly, on how exactly do we deal with the strong sentiments that of the people that come out of these conflicts? But secondly, how do we then move forward at the end of the day? All right, first issue, how do we deal with these strong sentiments, right? Because this is the main crux of opening government's case. The entire idea of how you have fresh ones and therefore individuals are too attached and we probably won't get the justice that we want. We say no. We think oftentimes what we do get to begin with is the fact that at a period right now where they would much rather on their side, then focus on economic reform or reparation, the fact is that those kinds of things then slowly start to obscure or limit the space that these people will ever have to be able to express themselves, right? What you end up then doing is masking the wounds of these very people. That is why we think that at the end of the day, if you want to be able to strike a balance between these people being swayed by fresh minds and then versus just masking the wounds completely, we think we would much rather on our side gather more information to check these very emotions that people have, right? And recognize these wounds as well, such that these people will more likely even listen to other groups to begin with. It is only by letting them know that we recognize your stance and your narrative that you even move forward to any point or being able to achieve any justice at the end of the day. We think moreover, by the time they think on their side that these wounds have healed, and we doubt that they ever will, we think what will happen is you lose that critical period where you actually can collect crucial information to actually get that restorative justice. So on their side, at the very best case, you only compromise that further. We think that's a problem. Oh, thank you. For the next, this entire idea then of how do we then move forward. And so they bring us this stance coming from opening government of this idea that, well, we'll still allow international organizations to step in, right? Discourse in the public will just not be allowed. Here's the thing. At the very best case, what you do is you prosecute the right person in spite of, one, investigations being in closed doors, two, the international community conducting the investigation as an outsider. So they weren't even there or involved within the conflict to begin with. But secondly, the very international community conducting that cannot even collect information from the people because the people themselves cannot talk. So we think, where on earth will these people even get the information that you collect? But even if after all of those kinds of problems, you still are able to prosecute, we think that's based on the assumption that prosecutions are enough, right? But ultimately, we think it's far more beyond that. We think what you get in closing opposition is that never mind at the very worst case that you get misrepresented and misinformed justice on their side, but secondly, you also just lose the fact that at the end of the day, truth is not just about objective facts, right? It's about the discussion and this exchange of narratives within individuals. That is the kind of benefit you get from the mechanism that we provide on closing opposition side. At the end of the day, it is for all those reasons we are proud to oppose.
Speech, now from the end debate, all speech cross the floor, stands, change pleasantries, and head outside.
Change pleasantries. Wow, so genuine.
Yeah. I need some time. Yeah. It'll take a while.